Thank you, panelists. Next up, we have Jared Landsman. He's going to be presenting on Title 24 Lifecycle Cost and Source Energy Metrics. I'm pleased to introduce Jared. Jared has 8 years of experience in the building industry, focused on decarbonization and electrification policy. He's a managing consultant at E3, where he's been leading work on California's 2025 building energy codes and standards. So we're going to have an opportunity to ask Jared some questions after his presentation as well. Thanks.
All right. Hi, everyone. So before I get started, I want to just sort of do a quick poll of at least the folks in the room. How many of you, raise your hand if at least at some point in your career have touched or been involved with a code compliance model in the state of California? All right, so basically everyone in the room. Now, follow-up question, how many of you actually understand what a TDV factor is, why it exists, where it comes from, and how it's developed? All right, so maybe about half of you. So that's 50% of this room is probably a higher percentage than the general public of, or the general group of energy modelers in the state. So I have two goals today. One of which is to sort of demystify these metrics and explain what they are, why they exist, how we develop them. And my second goal is to actually sort of shift the mindset around them. We know that these metrics are developed for the Title 24 like new construction standards, but I actually want energy modelers to start thinking of these metrics as another tool in their toolkit and actually think about them as a way to influence your designs and optimize your buildings to impact the statewide energy system. And for those of you who tuned into the CEC workshops on these over the last few months, I apologize, you're going to see some of the same content, but I'm going to try my best to frame it to the energy modeling group in the room today and on the call. So to start off, I want to just sort of go over what are these metrics. So I think most of you in the room have heard of TDV factors. It's going to be quite controversial, but there are talks. It's looking very likely that for the 2025 code cycle, so that's 3 years from now, the name of these is likely going to change. As of right now, I'm going to refer to them as lifecycle cost factors or system-wide lifecycle cost factors. There's a possibility they might be called SLCC in the future, so I know some of you have a lot of feelings about that. So what are these factors? So lifecycle cost factors, or TDV factors, are basically a method of converting site energy consumption to, and here's the key phrase that I want everyone to remember, long-term dollar savings to California's energy system. So this is a concept that is a little out there, but I'm hoping everyone by the end of this session understands what that means. And so obviously, I think most of you in the room know that these are used to look at cost, or to actually see projects in CBEC Res, CBEC Com, if they comply with energy code. Most of you also probably know that the other major use of these is to do cost effectiveness analysis for measures that are proposed to be added to the Title 24 code. And I think what's key is that the initial reason why these were developed is really because of the Warren-Alquist Act, which basically requires us to show that anything we add to California's Title 24 energy code must be cost effective. The other major metric that we're going to talk about today was introduced in the 2022 code cycle, so it will be going into effect in the January in 2023. And these are the source energy hourly factors. And essentially, these are pretty intuitive. These, I hope, basically convert site energy to source energy. And there's a big question out there, which is, are these carbon emissions? The answer is no, but sort of. So the real answer is that no, these are not exactly carbon emission factors. We actually develop emission factors totally separately, and those are also available to the public. But these are a way that we can sort of create a proxy for greenhouse gas emissions that is allowed by the Warren-Alquist Act. So how do these metrics actually come about, and how do they get developed? So I'm just going to quickly go through this flow of our sort of modeling methodology that we use to develop the factors, and then I'll go into a little bit more detail. So everything starts with what we call scenario analysis. So to develop these factors, we need to project what the future is going to look like for the next 30 years in the state of California. And this requires us to sort of predict what are the policies that are going to exist, and how will that translate to both the supply side and the demand side. So we start by actually selecting a specific demand scenario that reflects a potential future in the state of California. And this is probably the most controversial part of TDV development or SLCC development, because the demand scenario that we select has really big implications on what these factors end up looking like. So the next side of this, at least on the electric factor side, we then move on to resource modeling. So trying to really use some of our models to identify what are the optimal electric resources, what would be the optimal electric resource portfolio in the state to meet all of the policy goals and to also meet all of the demand side goals. And from there we do energy market modeling. So we essentially simulate hourly electric sector operations with all of these new loads and resources to understand what the actual energy costs will look like in the future. On the gas and propane side, we do a similar exercise looking at projected utility costs or basically the costs that the utility would incur to continue safely operating. And in addition, with the predictions or forecasts of throughput, we then develop gas and utility costs. Then as a final step, we look at do some GHG accounting. Essentially, on both the electric side and the gas side, we see what are the anticipated greenhouse gas emissions. There's a few different components of these factors that account for GHG, both direct GHG costs through cap and trade, in addition to potential future costs in order to hit our GHG emissions reductions targets. And then finally, these all sort of come together. We aggregate all these different components of marginal cost and convert that all to a net present value over a certain analysis period. And this all becomes these Excel files that are released to the public. I hope most of you know where they are, but if you don't, I'm going to make sure by the end of this presentation that you do. And that's sort of the very, very basic, oh here, if there's anybody wanted one last look. That's the very basic methodology. So, and sort of as a precursor to all of this, so E3 does not do this work personally, but a precursor to all that modeling is that we have to generate new weather files for the state. And most of you know that there are weather files that exist for all 16 climate zones in the state of California. These get, at least in the last code cycle, they went through updates for 2022, and they will also, there will be new weather files for the 2025 code cycle. And essentially they're, as you all know, they're essentially TMY files based on historical data. I know there's talks in a future code cycle about trying to incorporate future weather into this whole process, so that's something that is being discussed. And what's critical, and this is kind of unique to California, is that all these weather files essentially use the same historical weather years across each climate zone. And the reason that matters is because we need to make sure that we can basically align our factors across the entire state. So everything sort of peaks at the same time. And this is really relevant when we're talking about system-wide energy operations. As I said, that demand scenario selection is a really critical piece to this process. So what I'm about to, what I'm showing here and in the next few slides is all related to the 2025 code cycle. So these are not going to impact the 2022 factors you start using in January, but this is just sort of looking into the future. So for 2025, we chose a scenario called the CEC High Electrification Policy Compliance Scenario. It's a mouthful. And essentially we chose this scenario because we felt that, or I should say that the commissioner really ultimately chose this scenario because it was felt that this represented a realistic future that aligned with existing policies and some anticipated policies. And it also incorporated a future that does include high electrification. So in previous code cycles, at least especially for 2022, the scenario that was selected was sort of a mid-electrification scenario. For 2025, we've sort of gone the rest of the way and chosen a true high electrification scenario. And so, yeah, so obviously this has some pretty big implications that flow down into the rest of the factors. Some key things to point out on the resource side, we've incorporated the impacts of SB 100, which means that light blue bar you see there for the electric sector essentially goes to 0 emissions by, I think, 2045. And then we've also incorporated stuff from SB 1440, which dictates a certain amount of RNG in the gas pipeline over the next few years. One other critical piece is that it doesn't have huge implications on our analysis, but the scenario we selected actually does miss some of the statewide emissions goals, notably the 80% reduction by 2050 goal. And this was a little controversial during our workshops. The reason we ultimately selected it was because we felt that this represented a true realistic future while still accomplishing high electrification. Just to go a little bit more into the demand scenario. So essentially, to create our annual forecast, we pull those results from that demand scenario. So we basically pull historical electric load, and then we layer on new hourly transportation load and new hourly building electrification load from that scenario. All the loads we put into our model undergo a weather regression using those California weather files. So everything is normalized to those weather files. What we see on the screen here is, on the left-hand side, is the electricity consumption forecast. So our demand scenario, as I said, had really high transportation electrification incorporated into the 30-year forecast. And I would say moderate building electrification, more so on the residential side, less so on the commercial side. But as you can see, if on the right-hand side we have the gas consumption forecast, and the yellow is the residential gas. And so this forecast basically shows that the residential gas consumption between 2030 and 2040 has drastic reduction. And this has really big implications on the gas factors. I've included this slide sort of as just to nerd out with energy modelers. So as I said, we get these annual forecasts from that demand scenario, but because these factors are 8760, we need to actually give them a load shape. So for those of you here yesterday, you might have heard Matt Delhausen talk about ResStock and ComStock. So we actually pulled hourly load shapes for each of the 16 climate zones by end use for ResStock and ComStock in order to capture the electrification of building end uses. And then on the electric vehicle side, we pulled load shapes from the 2021 IPER. So as I said, these all have pretty big implications on gas. So the gas throughput comes directly from that forecast in our model. We also look at gas revenue requirements for the gas utilities. This came from IPER, combination of IPER and the utility general rate cases. So what's critical here is that there's an assumption that utility costs are going to continue as usual to maintain the safety and reliability of that gas system, but the throughput is going to dramatically decrease. So what that translates to is this gas rate forecast that you see on the right-hand side of the screen, which goes up pretty dramatically over the 30-year period. We've actually implemented an 8% annual growth rate cap with the assumption that in the future, there will be some intervention from the state or the CPUC to make sure that these gas rates don't completely explode. But even with that cap, the rates are still quite high in our model. As I said, on the electric side, we do some resource portfolio modeling. So essentially, trying to get the optimal electricity generation portfolio to match the climate goals and to match the demand. And we use sort of a custom resource procurement model to meet those statewide energy procurement targets. And in order to get our 8760 profiles, we also do a sampling of site-specific historical NREL data for wind and solar generation across the entire region. I also mentioned we do this energy market modeling. This is essentially to calculate the marginal energy price that is covering the entire Western interconnection, or WEC, because electrons don't actually care where they come from. So our grid has electricity, California's grid has electricity coming from the entire region. So for this project, we actually were able to make use of the energy market model that was used in development of the IPER. But then we layered on our additional updates to that model. So we incorporated our own load projections, supply side generation mix, and renewable generation shapes. So I just threw a lot at you, but I think these next few slides will hopefully bring it all together. So essentially we have we want to end up with these life cycle cost factors. And in doing so, we calculate all these different components of marginal cost. And so basically, they all contribute to the marginal cost of either electricity, gas, or propane, specifically the cost to California's energy system. So I want to repeat that. These cost components are specific to the entire statewide energy system. Now, just to layer on some additional confusion, in addition to all those cost components, we have something that is at least currently called a retail rate adder. And this retail rate adder is basically added to all of these marginal cost components to ensure that the total metric matches an annual rate forecast. So, and some portion of that retail rate adder is flat. So essentially it's sort of representative of like a fixed charge that a customer might see. And some portion is time dependent. So it follows the same shape as those marginal costs. So at the end of the day, these metrics represent total costs to the statewide or the energy system, but they are normalized at the end to these annual rate forecasts. So it's a very hard thing to sort of fully comprehend what that metric means. I think the biggest takeaway is that it's not a customer bill, it is the statewide energy system cost. Now the final step, now this is where we're gonna get some more controversy in the room, is that these factors are levelized, or are converted to a levelized net present value over the lifetime, or over the analysis period. So in previous code cycles, different measures had different periods of analysis. For 2025, we're moving to every single measure having a 30-year lifetime. So no matter what, all of the factors that are going to be released for 2025 are representative of a 30-year net present value cost. And here's the real kicker. So I think most of you who are familiar with TDV factors have seen these metrics, or these units of kBTU per kilowatt hour and kBTU per therm. In my opinion, those metrics were very confusing. No one really understood what those represented. Now, in the past, essentially, everything was calculated in dollars, and then there was a conversion factor that was applied on top of it to convert everything to these energy units, these sort of vague energy units that we don't really know what they represent. So for 2025, we're actually going back to using dollars. The reason this is controversial is because the reason in the first place why they were switched to an energy unit is because there was a fear that the community would misinterpret these TDV dollars as customer utility bills. So we feel, though, for 2025 that it is actually less confusing if we go back to dollars. So I'm actually going to pose a request to the energy modeling community at large. I'm hoping that you guys will understand that, or will know that these are not representative of customer utility bills. They are system-wide energy costs, and be able to communicate this appropriately to building owners. So this is still all in flux. Obviously, this isn't going to hit for another 3 years because this is the 2025 code cycle, but in the next 3 years, I pose this challenge to you all to figure out the correct language on how to talk about these factors. I'm going to move quickly to just explain the source energy calculations, and then we can look at some actual results. So source energy, I think, is a little bit more intuitive. These represent the lifetime hourly average source energy of the consumption of your building. As I said, these are not explicitly emissions factors, but they are correlated. And these factors are calculated essentially using sector projections to meet state targets that are specifically coming from our selected demand scenario. And all of these are calculated using long-run marginal energy. So what does that actually mean? So if we look at this graphic on the side, short-run marginal energy is basically the increase in source energy from the marginal generator that's needed to meet the direct impacts of a change in the load on the grid. And the long-run marginal energy essentially incorporates the avoided source energy that we will no longer have to experience in the future as renewable generation increases on the grid. And so that basically is how we define these long-run source energy factors. One other key thing to note, so on the gas side of things, the gas source energy factors also incorporate any impact that we might see from a future decarbonized gas in the pipeline. So as I said, there is actually a Senate bill that will require a certain amount of RNG in the gas pipeline, so those are reflected in the source energy factors. So I'm going to go through this part quickly because obviously you guys are not actually going to use these factors for another 3 years, but I want the room to at least get a sense of the direction these factors are going in and what we can expect for the future. So on the electric side, what we see on the screen here are just basically a sample average hourly graphic of the electric factors. I broke it out in summer, and the top is winter, the bottom is summer, and on the left-hand side are the 2022 factors, the right-hand side are 2025. So you might see that those shapes are quite different, and the actual magnitude of those bars are quite different. So basically across the board, our electric factors are going to go up. Part of this is because the actual rate forecast that we're normalizing to is going to go up. And then also importantly, the actual shape is different because of that high electrification scenario. So a lot of those capacity costs and T&D costs are shifting to nighttime hours or winter hours because suddenly we're introducing all this electric heating. On the gas side, as I said many times, the gas factors have gone up quite significantly, about 80% increase between 2022 and 2025. And that's mainly also because of this high electrification scenario that's been selected. That's really mainly impacting the residential side of things because that's where all that high electrification is coming from. On the non-res side, we are also seeing an increase, but that's actually not so much to do with the electrification, more to do with the fact that we're changing that period of economic life. So in previous code cycles, non-res always used the 15-year life. We're now using the 30-year life. And so what does this actually mean for cost effectiveness for you guys? So across the board, gas and electric rates, gas and electric factors are going up. So generally speaking, that should mean efficiency strategies are going to be more cost effective. If the operating costs are going up, then that'll offset more of those savings will offset more of the upfront cost. And then most importantly, because our residential gas factors are going up, this has really big implications on residential electrification cost effectiveness. So generally speaking, electrification strategies in the residential sector are going to look more cost effective because those gas rates are so much higher. On the source energy side, less significant changes, but some slight reductions. Mainly we're seeing those during winter nighttime hours. Going down at night, and a lot of that is because we've introduced offshore wind into our model for the 2025 code cycle. So that just adds renewable capacity that is available at night. And finally, I want to go through a few quick slides. So hopefully by now you at least have a better sense of what these metrics mean, but I want to specifically sort of drive home for this community, for energy modelers, how can you use these metrics? What does this actually mean to you? So when you're talking to owners or clients, things to keep in mind. These metrics definitely do not represent current year customer bills. They are a completely separate thing. They don't represent building site energy consumption, and they don't represent greenhouse gas emissions. The things they do represent are lifetime costs to the statewide energy system and source energy consumption. And it's key that, I think one other reason why it was really important to separate, to make the life cycle cost factors dollars again, is so that we don't have two metrics that are in KBTU, because that, I think, would have just confused owners even more. We'll see what happens in the next 3 years once the 2022 code cycle hits. I don't have to explain this to you guys. This is all sort of layered into the compliance software. I think you know that it's all in CBEC Res and CBEC Com. What's important is that this, for the 2025 code cycle, will be showing TDV cost, or it might have a new name, SLCC cost. And this one I really wanted to make sure everyone saw. If you ever want to look at these factors outside of a compliance model, they are all available to you online for free on the CEC's website. So once you have access to these slides, feel free to go to this link. I think the 2025 factors will also be available soon in the next few weeks. So all these factors are available, source energy, life cycle costs, and the emissions factors, which are not explicitly part of code compliance, but they are available to the energy modeling community at large. Everything in an 8760 format. In addition, we actually have our TDV calculator publicly available online. So you can choose any climate zone, choose your units that you want to look at, and it will automatically regenerate everything by cost component, and you can look exactly at how everything is calculated. And finally, I want to just really showcase, we think of these as compliance metrics, but in reality, these metrics can definitely be used if we want to optimize for statewide performance. So as building designers, we're often just thinking at the building level. In reality, we want to be scaling up and thinking, what does this mean for decarbonization across the state? So if we really care about operational carbon, then we should be thinking about how to optimize that statewide energy system, whether it be from an source energy perspective or a cost perspective. So I would highly recommend you all use these metrics outside of CBEC Res and CBEC Com and use them in your general modeling process to actually, as a tool, to figure out how should we implement battery storage or demand response or our actual HVAC and water heater strategies to actually optimize the statewide energy system. So finally, hopefully you all have a better sense now of what these factors are, that these life cycle cost factors are long-term dollar savings to California's energy system. As I said, in 2025, we can expect generally these factors to go up from those high electrification scenarios. Source energy factors, this is a final reminder, they are not emission factors, but they are a good proxy for them, and they're all publicly available. So, thank you.
Thank you, Jared. It's an important and complex topic, so thanks for trying to break that down for everyone. We will take some questions. I knew we were going to have a lot. Mark, I saw you jumping on that last point. So,
very interesting presentation. I've been following this stuff for a long time. So I was curious, how are you going to account for behind the meter resources in a high DER future? There's a lot of studies happening at the Energy Commission, at the CPUC, and it seems like there's scenarios in the avoided cost calculator where there's no benefit to saving energy in the middle of the day if you have a battery and then dispatch it and then put it back. And so it seems like the ACC has historically been fatally flawed. And so I'm really curious, how does TDV and the evolution of it fit into the avoided cost calculator, and how might that be sending the wrong signals to people in this room that I would recommend don't use the ACC because it really doesn't benefit customers or reflect reality?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the ACC is also developed by E3. So there's obviously a lot of similarity between the two models. I believe, I'd have to double check, but I believe behind the meter storage is accounted for in our resource procurement model. I'd have, no, okay, I'd have to double check exactly. But I mean, well, I will say behind the meter storage can be incorporated into the process of evaluating a specific building. So I guess what your point is, it's not incorporated into the factor itself. I mean, it's true. It is definitely not an ideal situation if we can't incorporate that, but it's, yeah, I mean, you're right. It has some flaws.
All right, we'll do an online question next.
All right, I am a stand-in for Meg Waltner. Could you provide more detail on the specific rate forecast that's being used to determine the retail adder? And then there's a second question too.
Yes. So for the electric side, we are using rate forecasts from the 2021 IPER. On the gas side, these were developed using a model that we built, essentially pulling in the forecasted throughput from the demand scenario, and we used the revenue requirements that were publicly available through both IPER and general rate cases from the utilities.
And then the second half of this question is, I'm also interested in the time of use forecast that you showed in comparison to the SLCC values in last week's CEC presentation. Can you speak to what time of use rates those were? Yes,
so I guess for clarity for the rest of the group, we compared the TDV factors or SLCC factors to a time of use rate just to sort of show how the shape is fairly similar. The time of use rates that we were looking at were a sort of projected rate for either commercial or residential based on historical trends in on-peak to off-peak ratio. So obviously we can't know, and it's sort of out of the scope of the development of these factors to know what those rate structures will look like in the future. But there was a lot of comment from stakeholders in the last cycle about how much shape should be added to those retail rate adders versus just keeping them completely flat, which they have been historically. So we were trying to use these projected time of use rates to just get a better sense of how much shape we should add to those factors, or to the retail rate adders.
Yep, Mazi.
Mazi Shirak, Energy Commission. On your slide 20, you showed for the 2025, the early evening peak was much smaller than 2022.
That's that one.
And I was kind of curious because, yeah, right there.
So I think what you're referring to is so the bottom
summer,
graphs
the
are representative of the summer. The top graph is representative of the winter.
Yeah,
so what's actually happening is that the shift is just going from summer to winter, but it's still happening in the evening.
But I mean, the summer, the air conditioning load's not changing in the summer just because you're
right. But
more.
basically what's driving the T&D load is now switching to the winter because it's a winter peaking system with the high electrification.
Neil Cruz.
Neil Cruz, Big Ladder Software. So you're saying that the source energy factors are correlated to emissions. Are they correlated through a constant scalar, or is it a little more sophisticated than that?
I believe they are correlated through a constant scalar. I think that is correct.
So
yes.
The signal is identical.
The signal is identical, right.
Okay, we'll do Gina and then an online question.
I'll be better than yesterday. Gina Rada from Gable Energy. It's not so much a question as an opinion. The dollar thing sucks.
Yeah, so Ted Tiffany told me you were going to say that. And I assume it's because of the confusion with owners that you say that?
Oh, you want to qualify my response? Okay, fine. Yes, very much so. We deal with dollars with so many conversations, and the fact that you had to forewarn us, how many times I counted 4, about how we have to explain this new measurement that's a fake measurement that's using a value that we all think we know? No, please don't.
Well, I'll throw this back to you. So I agree that I personally find the reason it's confusing is because we haven't seen it as dollars in the past. However, I posed to you the question, how did you talk to clients about this KTDV or TDV KBTU value?
Would you like to come into my classroom? And I'd be happy to do that with you.
Well, I guess my real point is that was sort of, I mean, the CEC feels that the previous units were also confusing in a different way.
They were a unit that I had to explain because they didn't assume they knew what it meant. You are now moving it to a measurement that people think they know, but I still have to explain. And the fact I'm not always going to be in front of them when they're looking at these reports. And they're going to potentially 5 years from now go, look at this dollar value, and that's not what we're getting on my energy bill. Whose name was on this? Oh, it's Gina's name on this. I'm going to sue her because this is not what I paid for.
This sounds like an excellent challenge that I posed to you to try to figure out in the next 3 years.
I want you guys to really think this through carefully, and please come up with something other than a dollar sign.
There is a public comment process, yeah. Yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely.
Okay, we'll take an online question.
On? Oh, okay. So I want to voice a discussion in the chat just to bring everyone into that. There's some discussion between virtual participants about terminology being a bit too similar to other common industry metrics focused on site-specific considerations. So Meg Waltner writes, I support changing the name of TDV, but think including the term life cycle cost in the name might be confusing. Is it similar to other costs that might be presented to building owners, similar to Gina's comment? Dave also says, I'm a fan of changing system-wide to societal as being clearer for less technical audiences. So virtual participants are curious if others in the room also think that these might be, referring to these as life cycle costs might also be confusing. I might say that that's also another good candidate for the public comment system.
Absolutely. If anyone has thoughts on the units or the name, definitely post it to the public docket or take it up with one of the folks in the CEC room right now. So these are sort of, I know these are still being discussed, and I don't think any of that's been quite finalized yet. But at least just for the public workshops and for today, we've been referring to them as these life cycle cost metrics. So, but yeah, it's absolutely open to more ideas, I think.
I wanted to tag on to that, just the last question from the chat from Jamie Bacchus at ME Engineers. Why or how would RNG vary hourly?
RNG does not. So the gas TDVs or gas factors are constant across the entire month. So gas factors do not vary hourly.
Thank you.
So my name is Tao. I'm with the CEC. I just want to point out that we had a workshop last week, like Jared said. And if you have any strong feeling about the naming or whatever, please submit your comments. And comment period is closing next Wednesday. So please do 5 p.m. Pacific time, of course. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Sander Armelia. I was a bit confused with when you mentioned I believe in the source energy factors, you mentioned that you're counting in offshore wind energy in there.
Yes, that's correct.
And but as far, to the extent of my knowledge, I believe there's not going to be any offshore wind online before 2028 at the very earliest, more likely 2030.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So because this is the 2025 code cycle and these go into effect in 2026, the analysis period for the development of these is from 2026 to 2055. So that is the 30-year period we look at for this analysis.
Any others? Okay, well, thank you all. We're going to take a break, and the next session will be 10:15 Pacific with your working groups. Thank you.